everybody. I wanted to give you some helpful tips on managing the load. And by load, I mean primarily your reading load, as well as your cognitive load or your working memory, and finally your time load. And the way I'll approach that is by primarily looking at reading, your pre-reading activities, while reading and post, and then think about what you can do down the road with some retention activities. Generally, I'm driven by 3 questions, and those are what, so what, and now what. So you'll see how I use those in my reading activities. Finally, I'm going to give you a demonstration of how Google Scholar can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Let's get started. Your pre-reading activities are all about establishing a purpose for reading, and that's a really important metacognitive skill to have as your habit of thinking. And the 2 questions that frame that for me are what and so what. So if you're looking at number 1 here, this is all about the course readings. Begin with the session overview and see what the course designer has highlighted for all of the topic itself, but also the readings. Within that session overview, and if you move down to the discussion question, this is really the nitty-gritty, getting down into the weeds focus for you. Keep this discussion prompt prominent and nearby as you're reading. If at the end you're still not quite sure how it fed into the discussion question, you may want to go back to the syllabus and have a look quickly through the program goals or the course level objectives. That sounds a bit strange, but actually sometimes you'll see, it must be because they're building this skill or this habit of thinking that they had me do this reading. Alternatively, you can just simply revisit the topic itself within the syllabus and try to make meaning that way. Second, you're going to be, of course, reading a lot of research related to your problem of practice. And in those instances, of course, you'll be looking for factors that contribute to the problem of practice or drivers, the particular constructs that they use, how they define those, how they operationalize them, and even the measures over time. I also recommend you at this stage to see how they define their problem of practice. So that's a real purpose for reading. It doesn't mean that you read every single word. It just gives you kind of a compass and a purpose for reading initially. Okay, so you have your purpose and now it's time to start reading. Of course, many of you will highlight and annotate, and there's no problem with that. I'm just going to share a few tips related to those 2 activities and also try to get you to think about leaving yourself a trail of breadcrumbs. In addition, I'm also going to share a note-taking resource that I think is really helpful. So back to highlighting. In general, the research shows that the less you highlight, the better. And generally, people who don't highlight a great deal have already thought very carefully about their purpose for reading, and they only highlight the content that really serves that purpose. In addition, if you have the luxury of time to skim through the reading initially, stop and think about how the reading serves your purpose, and then go back afterwards to highlight. That all tends to build towards greater retention and deeper learning. Now for annotating, the more you annotate in your own words, the better. And again, I'm always encouraging you to disagree with the text and note where there's a mismatch with your own experience. I also want you to think about driving questions and key ideas. It's great if you can write actual questions in the margins that are answered within the text itself. Those driving questions will serve you later in your review of the materials. And the key ideas, again, are those key takeaways that are related to your purpose. Now, thinking back about the breadcrumbs that both highlighting and annotating can serve, it's really helpful to think about on the very front page of your PDF to leave those breadcrumbs. And so at the very top, I write notes to myself about the helpful content within that article. Sometimes it's simply a table, or it could be a diagram that really was memorable for me and it's something I want to return to. So I refer to that very explicitly on the front page with my notes. I also make sure that I pinpoint where key definitions are, and that's all about operationalizing your construct. So anytime you have a definition, it's helpful to note where it is. And I put that on the front page of the article. Also, I think about the driving questions that this article answers, or the key ideas or the key takeaways. I write those on the front cover, and very, very importantly, I make a mention of where those page numbers, where that content is. Always make sure that your breadcrumbs include the page numbers where those are. So think about 2 months from now when you come back to this article. At your very first glance, you've already done the heavy lifting of identifying what helpful content is in there, what information that serves your purpose, such as definitions or operationalized constructs, as well as some driving questions and key ideas that you've already put the effort into formulating. And again, those page numbers you'll be very thankful that you included. All right, so those breadcrumbs are helpful, but many of you will probably want to take notes on some of those resources that you find. And to help you with that, I want you to consider having a look at Jennifer Gonzalez's work over at The Cult of Pedagogy. If you don't have time to read this blog post, you can simply go there and have a look at the podcast, download it on your phone and listen to it. It's really well worth the time it takes to listen to it. Within her blog, she also refers to some work by Doug Neal, who has a YouTube site called Verbal to Visual. I haven't checked out this particular site, but I have watched this video probably 4 times because he explains note-taking so very well. And what you see here is on the left, this is a common approach called the Cornell method or Cornell notes. And what he recommends is an approach to adding visuals to your notes, beginning with Cornell as the framework and then adding visuals. So I highly recommend listening to the podcast, reading her work if you get a chance, but then taking the time, it's only a 10-minute video, to have a look at Doug Neal's work. Okay, so we've read and annotated, highlighted, and taken some notes, and importantly, we've left that trail of breadcrumbs on the top of the PDF. Next is, what do we do with that information? How can we make it stick? First of all, I highly recommend that you start populating your Excel spreadsheet for your annotated bibliography. If you're in your second year, you're likely already doing that and maintaining that Excel spreadsheet, or you're keeping chapter notes. I used to keep a separate file for each of the chapters with the purpose of the chapter at the top, and then I just started adding different pieces of information that I wanted to go back and add it to at the end of the semester when I had more time. Another way to use that information is to recall it in your discussion post. Try to weave it into your discussion post for that session or a following session. Third is probably the most important in my opinion, and that's actively retrieving it by talking about it. And that can happen in your car anytime you're driving, on your commute, or on any trip. Start talking about it. You'll quickly see what you did understand, what you didn't understand, and what you forget. And that will prompt you to go back and reread it for a really important purpose. Also talk about it in the shower. If you read something and hop into the shower, it doesn't hurt to retrieve it in your brain and think about how you would explain it to someone like your partner or a colleague. And the fourth point is, don't forget to pay it forward. If you read something and spend some time on it and finally realize that it's not as important to you as you thought, it may not be relevant, don't throw it away. You may want to think about who in the program, in your cohort, or anybody you've worked with, who it might be relevant to, and send it off to that peer. Okay, so let's think now about how to retain that information. And I really caution you not to worry about it too much. If you've taken all the time to highlight, annotate, leave a trail of breadcrumbs, and in some cases take notes and then add it to an Excel spreadsheet or to chapter notes. Keep moving in the course, keep up with all of the reading, but think about what you can do between semesters, and that will happen at the end of this semester in January. And what I'll encourage you to do is to start thinking about the patterns and matches and mismatches of the content. And that's really what an expert starts to do in his or her content area. So moving from novice to expert along that continuum as a scholar in the program, you will, at the end of this course, start to see some of the patterns between the courses and across time, as well as patterns related to your problem of practice. And the more you talk about it, write about it, and just plain think about it, the more you're going to retain it. So you may want to block off some time in your calendar and set up a time with a few people in the course that you're already gelling with and you see that you can work with them. Set a time to just reflect on the course and your coursework and what you learned. And again, think about what patterns did we see, what connections can we make, what matches with our understanding, and where are those mismatches? Where do I disagree with that content? Now, the last tip I wanted to share with you relates to Google Scholar and really having you be in the driver's seat or be the puppeteer and using these 4 features of Google Scholar to help you with your research. And that's cited by and related articles within the hits that you get, and then thinking about the time frame of when things were published and setting up alerts. So I'll escape out of this presentation and start at the Johns Hopkins Sheridan Library, and I'll log in. It's really important to log in and go through the library itself. So I'm now logged in, and I'll go back to the library and make my way to Google Scholar by going to Articles and Databases and then Google Scholar. So here I'll enter my search terms. So let's say I'm interested in note-taking and higher education. And if you're not sure why I'm using those quotation marks as part of my search string, just reach out to me and I can give you more information on that. So I'll click that and I end up on Google Scholar. And what's so handy is it tells me and gives me a direct link to finding it within the JHU library. But what's more important here is that I always actually, whenever I find something that is interesting to me, I'm really interested in cognitive effort, for example, I want to see who else has cited it. So I'll open this up, of course, and if it's an empirical study and I can use it, that's great. But I see, it's over 13 years old. I want to see who else has cited it and for what purposes. So then I get a series of articles that have cited that work, and let's say I want to find something even within those citations or those articles, and let's say it's related to college and first generation students. So within that, I want to look within people who have cited that. Okay, interesting. So I have 2 more very specific articles that are related to college, first-generation students, and their cognitive effort during note-taking. So you see how you can really narrow down your search by using cited by. Another helpful feature of Google Scholar is this related articles bit. So Google Scholar can be pretty smart at times, and it thinks about, well, this article is about cognitive effort in note-taking, and these articles may not have cited this, but they are indeed related. And it just takes you down another rabbit hole that is usually helpful, and it's a lot more narrow a scope. And I'll just turn that off. So that's cited by and related articles. Another feature is to think about the time. So as I said, 2005 is a little bit old. It's still usable, but let's say you have found this from 96 and you really want to look at something more recent. So you can use this custom range feature. Let's say you want things in the last maybe 20 years. So you can put 1998 and 2018 and do a search that narrows it that way. And then you find a few things and you think, I want it more narrow. I'm going to go with 2008 and only find things within the last decade. And that's using that custom range feature, which is really, really helpful. So I also want to illustrate this create alert feature. And this is really making Google work for you for more recently published material. And that is creating an alert related to these 2 search terms. And all it does is anything that's published with these 2 search terms, that you're going to get an alert of what they are plus a link to those articles. So it's really handy. It's like one-stop shopping. So I find that super handy. And I also, once I find a researcher whose work it really, really speaks to me, I then set up a Google alert in case that researcher publishes or somebody cites that researcher in their work. I want to hear about it. So I did my intervention based on the work of Saskia Brand-Gruel. So what I did early on is I set up an alert with her name, and then anytime, as I said, anytime Saskia published, I got a notification, and anytime someone else published about her work, I got a notification. And that's really, really helpful earlier on in your first few years in the program to help Google do some heavy lifting for you. And that's really all I have. I just want to remind you once again that you should be reaching out when you need help. We're all here. The TAs and the instructors are here to help you. If you can ask your question in Ask the Instructor in Blackboard, that's great. If you prefer to email us, that of course is great. And then we have our office hours. So please continue to reach out and don't suffer in silence. Let us know how you're doing.